Welcome back to Talk Tickers, where we break down earnings calls and try to help you spot the trends that really matter. So today, we are tackling Constellation Energy's Q3 2024 call. And let me tell you, this one's got it all.
It does.
AI, power struggles, the future of nuclear energy. Even national security got thrown in the mix.
Yeah, it's fascinating how this call kind of reveals that Constellation's playing a much bigger game than just keeping the lights on. They're positioning themselves right at the heart of some huge technological shifts.
Okay, so first things first, their stock ticker symbol, CEG, has been a rocket this year, up over 93%. But then right after this call, bam, it takes a dip. Down about 12% at one point.
And that drop isn't because their numbers were bad. In fact, they beat earnings estimates and even raised their guidance for the whole year. Now they're saying they'll likely hit $8.20 per share, which is a whole 60 cents higher than they originally thought.
So it spooked investors. It all comes down to a recent ruling.
From FERC.
FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Basically, they said no to Constellation's plan to build data centers right next to power plants. Big problem, because Constellation has been betting big on powering these massive data centers, especially the ones used for AI.
Yeah, this is where it gets really interesting. Constellation's CEO, Joe Dominguez, basically came out swinging, saying this FERC ruling isn't the end of the story. He argued that letting them build data centers, new power plants, is absolutely crucial for the U.S. to win the AI race.
He even quoted Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, who's been warning that if America doesn't get its act together on AI, we could be putting ourselves at risk, talking high stakes.
Exactly. This highlights how important this whole co-location thing is. Constellation is basically saying, look, we're the only ones who can power these massive data centers quickly and cleanly, especially with our huge nuclear fleet in PJM. Now, for those who aren't energy nerds, PJM is this massive regional transmission organization that coordinates the movement of electricity across 13 states, mostly on the East Coast.
So they're making a big strategic play here, tying their future to the growth of AI. But how are they actually performing? Well, their nuclear fleet had another killer quarter, running at 95% capacity.
Wow.
That's like a finely tuned machine. Way more efficient than most other nuclear plants out there.
And the refueling outages were super fast, averaging less than 18 days, compared to the industry average of 40 days. This is why they're crushing it financially. They're getting more power out of their plants with less downtime.
They also talked about their commercial business, which is basically selling clean energy products to companies. Think of it like this. You've got companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all these massive companies. Those are the hyperscalers. And they need tons of energy to run their data centers.
Constellation is saying, hey, we can give you that energy, and it'll be clean and reliable. They've got these products called Core Plus and CFE that are really popular, with companies trying to meet their sustainability goals.
All right, so it's not just about generating power. It's about packaging it in a way that appeals to these big corporate customers who are trying to go green. They also mentioned that their Crane project, this massive clean energy center they're restarting, is getting tons of interest from hyperscalers.
And get this, they're even thinking about boosting the power output of their existing nuclear plants, which could add another 1,000 megawatts of capacity to the grid. That's a lot of juice.
Okay, so we've got this FERC ruling. That throws a wrench in their plans. But they're still pushing ahead with ways to power the data economy, both through deals directly with data centers and by working with utilities to get power where it needs to go.
This suggests that they're pretty confident they can find workarounds, even if the rules don't change. They're playing the long game here.
Now let's dig a little deeper into what Dominguez actually said about this whole FERC situation. He laid out three main points that he thinks should be part of the conversation about co-location, which is that whole data center next to power plant thing. He started by saying that if there's ever an emergency, nuclear power going to a co-located data center should get priority on the grid. Basically, make sure the data centers stay up and running, even if it means diverting power from other places. He was very clear about this, saying nuclear energy would be switched to the grid when needed to prevent those major blackouts.
Interesting.
His second point was that if a data center has its own backup power, it should be allowed to share that power with the grid.
Okay.
Makes sense, right?
Okay.
But of course, there are all sorts of state and environmental rules that would need to be figured out.
Right. Nothing is ever simple in the energy world. And finally, Dominguez said these co-located data centers should pay their fair share of the costs for using the grid.
So he's trying to address all the concerns people have raised about this co-location idea. But he also emphasized that Constellation is already working on deals that fit within the current rules, so they're not just waiting for the government to change its mind.
Right. He also mentioned that they're in talks with several hyperscalers, which tells you the demand is still there. These companies need clean energy, and they need it fast.
It's interesting that he kept saying anywhere in PJM when he talked about their ability to provide power to these data centers. It's almost like they're saying, look, we've got this huge network. We can get power to you wherever you need it.
That's a great point. He even used their deal with Microsoft. For the Crane project, as an example, Microsoft can actually use that energy in 4 different states, not just Pennsylvania where the plant is located. That's pretty unique.
Okay, so now let's dive into the nitty-gritty. The financials. As we said, they had a fantastic quarter, earning $3.82 per share, according to GAAP, and $2.74 per share in adjusted operating earnings.
And that strong performance was driven by several things, including how well their nuclear plants are running, great execution by their commercial team, and the benefit of that nuclear production tax credit, which is a big help to their bottom line.
Their CFO, Dan Eggers, pointed out that the commercial business is doing even better than they expected, which is why they bumped up their earnings forecast for the year.
He also mentioned that they're spending more on things like operations and maintenance this year, mainly because they're making more money and because stock-based compensation is higher.
But here's the thing. Looking ahead to 2026, Eggers warned that they'll have more refueling outages, and those outages will be longer than usual because they're planning to upgrade their Byron and Braidwood plants.
So that means they'll produce a bit less electricity, and their operating expenses will be higher in 2026. But hold on, they're still projecting they'll grow their earnings per share by at least 13% each year through 2030. That's some serious growth.
Eggers also gave a sneak peek into their capital allocation strategy, saying they'll be updating their 2-year cash available slide on the next earnings call to include 2026.
Okay.
And he emphasized they're still committed to buying back their own stock, as long as there's no insider information preventing them from doing so.
That's a sign they think their stock is undervalued, and that they're confident about the future. They're basically putting their money where their mouth is.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Strong financial performance, ambitious plans, but also some big question marks hanging over their future. Up next, we'll dig deeper into Constellation's growth strategy and talk about the risks and opportunities they face in this rapidly changing energy landscape. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Talk Tickers.
Before we went to break, we were in the middle of unpacking Constellation Energy's Q3 performance and their plans to become a major player in the data economy.
And those plans are ambitious, to say the least. They're projecting they can grow their earnings per share by at least 13% every year between now and 2030.
So where's all that growth going to come from?
Well, it's a multi-pronged strategy. First off, they've got this solid base of nuclear plants that are already running really well. There's strong demand for that kind of reliable, carbon-free power. And they're getting a nice boost from policies like the nuclear production tax credit. That gives them a steady stream of earnings and cash flow to work with.
Right, so that's like their bread and butter. But on top of that, we talked about their commercial business, which is basically selling clean energy packages to big companies. And that part of their business is growing like crazy, especially those Core Plus and CFE products we mentioned earlier.
And these products are clever because they're not just selling electricity. They're selling peace of mind. These companies are under pressure to reduce their carbon footprint. And Constellation is giving them a way to do that while ensuring they have reliable power for their operations.
So they're tapping into this whole sustainability trend, which is only getting bigger. Plus, they've got the Crane project coming online, and they're looking at squeezing more power out of their existing nuclear plants.
And they're not stopping there. They're even exploring new nuclear technologies, like small modular reactors or SMRs. These things are like mini nuclear power plants that are supposed to be safer, cheaper, and easier to build. It's a potential game changer for the industry.
So they're not just relying on their existing nuclear fleet. They're looking to the future of nuclear as well. But we can't ignore the big elephant in the room, that FERC ruling against co-location.
Right, that was a major blow. But Dominguez made it clear they're not giving up. They're talking to FERC, working with PJM, and even coming up with ways to do what they want within the existing rules.
It sounds like they're throwing everything they've got at this problem.
Well, they're betting on the fact that these massive data centers are only going to need more and more power, and that sooner or later the government will have to recognize that co-location is the best way to make that happen.
It's a risky strategy, but if they pull it off, the payoff could be huge. Now let's zoom in on their nuclear business for a minute. They're already the biggest nuclear power plant operator in the U.S., and they just keep getting better at it.
Their nuclear fleet is running at crazy high capacity factors, meaning they're getting a ton of power out of their plants. And those refueling outages are getting shorter and shorter.
That's a key advantage because it means they can produce clean, reliable power at a very low cost. And of course, they've got that nuclear production tax credit helping them out.
Right. That tax credit basically guarantees their nuclear plants will stay profitable, even when power prices dip. Now let's switch gears and talk about their commercial business. Those clean energy products they're selling to companies.
We talked about how that part of their business is booming, and it's not hard to see why. More and more companies are making pledges to go green, and Constellation is giving them a way to do that without sacrificing reliability.
It's a smart strategy because they're not just a power provider, they're a partner in helping these companies achieve their sustainability goals.
And that's a valuable position to be in, especially as the market for clean energy keeps growing. So even if the co-location issue drags on, they've got other ways to grow their business. They're not a one-trick pony.
Exactly. They've got this diversified business model that's well suited for the clean energy transition. But let's not sugarcoat things. Every investment has risks.
So what are some of the things that could go wrong for Constellation?
Well, we've already talked about the big one, regulatory uncertainty. That FERC ruling is a perfect example. Any changes in government policy or regulations could have a big impact on their business, especially in a highly regulated industry like nuclear power.
Right.
And it's not just about co-location. Any changes to safety regulations or rules about how they dispose of nuclear waste could really increase their costs or even force them to shut down plants.
Plus, they're facing stiff competition. The energy market is getting crowded with new players, and everyone's trying to grab a piece of that data center pie.
They're competing with traditional utilities, renewable energy companies. Everyone wants a piece of the action.
And let's not forget the inherent risks of nuclear power. It's statistically very safe. But if there's an accident at one of their plants, the consequences could be catastrophic.
Absolutely. We're talking about huge financial cost damage to their reputation, potential lawsuits, the whole 9 yards.
And then there's the risk of rising interest rates.
Yeah.
Constellation has a lot of debt. And if those interest rates keep climbing, it'll cost them more to borrow money and finance new projects.
That's something a lot of companies are worried about right now, especially those in industries like energy that require a lot of capital.
And on top of all that, Constellation's stock price can be pretty volatile. It tends to move up and down with things like energy prices, interest rates, and those regulatory developments we were talking about.
Right, so it's not a stock for the faint of heart. You've got to be comfortable with some ups and downs.
But let's not dwell on the negative. What are some of the opportunities that Constellation is well positioned to capitalize on?
Well, the biggest one is the growing demand for clean energy. As more countries and companies commit to reducing their carbon emissions, the demand for power sources like nuclear is going to skyrocket. And Constellation is already a leader in that space.
And like we discussed earlier, the need for data center capacity is exploding. Constellation's expertise in providing clean, reliable power to those data centers gives them a big leg up on the competition.
Plus, they're exploring those new technologies like SMRs, which could open up whole new markets and revenue streams for them.
Right. SMRs are more flexible and scalable than traditional nuclear plants, so they can be used for a wider range of applications.
Constellation is also investing in carbon capture technology for natural gas plants, which would allow them to reduce their emissions and appeal to a broader range of customers.
And they're working hard to get their existing nuclear plants relicensed, which would extend their operating lives and give them decades of additional revenue. So they've got a lot of irons in the fire. They're not just sitting back and waiting for things to happen.
Exactly. They're actively pursuing growth opportunities across their business. Now, the big question on everyone's mind is Constellation Energy stock a buy?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. It depends on your individual investment goals, how much risk you're comfortable with, and what you think the future holds for the energy market.
There are definitely some things to like about Constellation. They're profitable, they have a good track record of growing their earnings, they're in a good position to benefit from the clean energy transition, and they have a diversified business model.
But on a flip side, there's that regulatory uncertainty, fierce competition, and the inherent risks that come with nuclear power. Plus, they've got a lot of debt on their books, which could become a problem if interest rates keep rising.
So there are pros and cons to consider. If you're looking for a stable stock that pays dividends and gives you exposure to the clean energy sector, Constellation might be worth a look. But if you're really averse to risk or you're hunting for a high-growth stock, there might be better options out there.
Ultimately, it's up to each investor to decide whether Constellation Energy is the right fit for their portfolio. Now for the fun part. Let's move on to our This Is Not Financial Advice segment, where we throw out some crazy but not entirely impossible trade ideas.
Remember, this is just for entertainment, folks. Don't make any investment decisions based on what you hear here. All right, ready for this? What if Constellation takes this whole co-location thing to the next level and builds a data center city?
Whoa, a data center city. You're really thinking big here.
Just hear me out. They've got all this land around their nuclear power plants. Why not develop it into these massive data center campuses with everything a company could need? Power cooling, security connectivity, the whole shebang.
So they become like a one-stop shop for hyperscalers.
Yeah.
And other companies that need tons of computing power.
Exactly. They could even offer incentives to attract businesses and create this whole thriving ecosystem around their data center cities.
That's a bold vision. It would require a massive investment. But it could potentially transform Constellation from a power company into a tech infrastructure giant.
And it would tie their fortunes even more closely to the growth of the data economy. It's high risk, high reward.
I like where your head's at. It's a long shot, but I wouldn't rule it out entirely. Now for the final part of this episode, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Constellation Energy and share some final thoughts. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk Tickers. We've spent this episode dissecting Constellation Energy's Q3 earnings call. And it's clear they're making some bold moves in a rapidly changing energy landscape.
They're trying to grab a big piece of that data economy pie, but they've got some hurdles to overcome.
We've talked about their strengths, their nuclear expertise, those innovative products they're selling to companies, and their ambitious vision for the future.
But let's be realistic. There are some headwinds, too.
Absolutely. That FERC ruling against co-location is a major roadblock. It's still uncertain whether they can convince regulators to change their minds or find creative workarounds. And even if they do, there's a ton of competition out there. Other power companies are also eyeing that data center market, and some of them might have an edge when it comes to location or existing infrastructure.
And we can't forget about the bigger economic picture. Rising interest rates could make it harder for them to finance all these new projects. And if there's a recession, demand for energy could slow down.
So there are a lot of moving parts here. It's a complex situation. So what's the verdict? Is Constellation Energy a good investment?
Well, it's a company with a lot of potential, but also a fair amount of risk. A lot of their success depends on things they can't control.
Like getting the green light on co-location.
Yeah.
And outmaneuvering the competition in the data center market.
Exactly. Investors really need to weigh those factors and decide if Constellation's growth story aligns with their own risk tolerance and how long they plan to hold the stock.
If you believe in the long-term growth of the data economy, and you think Constellation can capitalize on it, this could be a really interesting opportunity.
But it's not a stock for the timid. You've got to have conviction and be willing to ride out some potential volatility.
Okay, so before we wrap up, we've got one final. This is not financial advice trade idea for you, and this one is a doozy.
Fasten your seatbelts, folks. What if Constellation doesn't just power data centers, but actually starts building and operating them themselves? Picture this. Constellation Data Centers, a whole new subsidiary.
Well, hold on. They'd be going from being an energy company to a full-fledged tech infrastructure player.
Think about it. They've already got the land around their power plants, the expertise in power management, and their strong relationships with the hyperscalers. They could offer unmatched reliability and sustainability.
They'd be a one-stop shop for any company. That needs massive computing power.
It would be a bold move, but it could be a brilliant way to set themselves apart from the competition and create a whole new revenue stream.
Of course it would tie their fate even more closely to the ups and downs of the data economy.
High risk, high reward.
All right, folks, there you have it. Constellation Energy is a company with a lot of potential, but their path forward is far from certain. Keep an eye on this one, because they're likely to be making headlines in the years to come.
And remember, this is Talk Tickers, where we break down earnings calls and help you spot the trends that matter. This is not financial advice. Do your own research. Talk to a financial professional. And as always, invest wisely. Until next time.